Welcome everyone to our session of Australian Women Pilots with Gabby Kenner. Before we start, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. So my name is Janet, I'm from Eastern Regional Libraries. And before I start, I want to let you know that I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I acknowledge them as traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, as well as the elders of any Aboriginal communities that you might be joining us from today, and any other Aboriginal elders who may be present with us today. But without further ado, I will introduce Gabby. So as a girl in country New South Wales, Gabby had only ever heard of 2 female pilots. Now, since that time, female representation in the industry has grown significantly. So in 1991, Gabby herself learnt to fly, and she is one of almost 2,000 female pilots in Australia today. Her book, Australian Women Pilots, tells the stories of some of Australia's pioneering aviators. I'm delighted to welcome her today to share her story and the stories of some of these fantastic women. Thank you, Gabby. Take it away.
Thank you. I've got it. There we go. Technology. Thanks, Janet, and thanks everyone for coming. I think there's some people I know, maybe Bronnie Bowen is listening. She's one of the Women Pilots Association members. And I'm not sure who else is online, but if there's anybody here who wants to say hi or ask any questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand, and I'm sure Janet will sort us out. So it's very special to be invited to speak to you today. I'm coming to you from Hanging Rock, which I believe you can see out the window. I'm down in my new office, which is a temporary arrangement in the hangar on our farm. So I'm Gabby Mexted. I'm a writer and photographer and the author of Australian Women Pilots, which you probably already know. I live at Hanging Rock with my husband, who's a Qantas pilot, and we've got 3 kids. One's an Air Force pilot. The second one is a daughter who has had flying lessons and would like to continue that when she finishes school this year. And the third one could think of nothing worse than getting in an airplane and flying it herself, but that might change. So I grew up in Finley in the Riverina, which is a small town in southern New South Wales near Tocumwal. It's got a population of 2,000, and I was the 5th of 8 children. So it was a busy household in a busy little town in the 70s that saw me playing a lot of sport and riding horses and basically doing a lot of running around with 6 brothers. I think it was that active upbringing that taught me the idea of possibilities. When I was 16, I went flying with Dad. So Dad, after he quit playing footy for the Finley Firsts when he was about 37, when he got to about 42, he decided to go and learn to fly. It was something he'd always wanted to do because he grew up near Essendon Airport. And so it was the early 70s, and flying had sort of come within the grasp of the general population in Australia, and little airports were springing up all over the place, and people were importing the American Cessnas and Pipers that became like the family station wagon. They were everywhere teaching people to fly around the country. So Dad was no different. He learnt to fly at Tocumwal, and him and about 6 mates got together and bought a Piper Archer, and that was their only asset. The Finley Flying Group had a Piper Archer Mike Alpha uniform, and it was based at Finley. So when I was about 16, I don't know if Mum wanted to get me out of the house or whether I did enjoy hanging out with Dad, because I preferred to be at the farm than home learning domestic chores. And so I went for a fly with Dad this day, and we were flying along the road to Berrigan. Above the road to Berrigan. It was just the 2 of us, which was quite unusual. And I asked him why the airplane, he took his hands off the control column and the steering wheel and had him on his knees. And he was looking out the window and deep in thought, because he was a farmer and he was probably assessing everybody's crops, you know, to see if the grass was greener over there. And it surprised and slightly alarmed me that he had completely seemed to have completely lost focus about flying the plane and was engrossed in what was happening outside. And so I said to him when he came back into the moment, you know, how come did you realise you'd taken your hands off the control column? And he explained, yeah, the aeroplane's in trim and it's a fine, beautiful day, and the aeroplane will just keep flying straight and level because I've got it set up that way. So then he explained the effects of the controls on the aeroplane. If you pull back, it goes up. If you push forward, it goes down. If you do that and do this with your feet, it does what it's meant to do. So he said, do you want to have a go? And I went, okay. So very nervously, I put my hands on the controls and did this. And that was my first go at flying. And once you get your hands on the controls, it shifts your perspective on everything once you've had a go at that. So I was flying along, sort of going up and down, trying to hold, you know, it takes a while to get the hang of it. And he said to me, you seem to be enjoying that. I don't know if I had a big grin on my face or if I was grimacing or what I was doing, and then he thought for a while and he said, if you'd like to learn to fly, I'll pay for it. Now, being the fifth of 8 kids, you can imagine a farming family. Dad was also a stock and station agent and an auctioneer. And that was a huge commitment from his part. It was bad enough that I had a horse that needed the occasional shoes, but to suddenly be offering flying lessons to one of the kids was a big thing. But maybe he felt that I needed, or they felt that I needed some focus or direction at that time. I don't know. Anyway, I said no because I was just learning to drive and that wasn't going so well. And I was doing year 12 the following year, and I just thought it's a bit too much on my plate. And so I said no, and he went, oh, okay. So about 10 years later, I lived overseas twice. So I'd had 4 years, 2 years in Singapore on posting with the Australian High Commission. I came home and did nursing, and then I went backpacking around the world for a couple of years. And when I was in Alaska, I went for a helicopter ride. And in the bar that night, I was regaling them with my one flying lesson and how I intended to go and get a license when I got home. I was 27 at that point. So I thought this was all good conversation, and one of the pilots looked across his beer when I'd finished my dissertation and said, bet you don't. And I couldn't believe it. Anyway, because it was what I fully intended to do. So I came home and I moved back in with mum and dad to their great delight, and worked at the local nursing home, which was quite challenging, I think, anyone who's worked in aged care, and went and learnt to fly. So over one winter, I did my restricted license at Tokemore, and the following winter, I did my unrestricted, which is your navigation flights. So that was great. And what happened then? I've lost track now. Yeah, I got my license, and then I went off. I was about to head off back to Canberra to a job that I had lined up, but life sideswipes you sometimes, and I got married instead to a hometown boy who's a Qantas pilot. So that was how I learnt to fly, and so I've had my license since 91, 92, and we've got a little plane and a strip here on the farm in central Victoria. So that was a change of direction. We've got 3 children, and at 45, I had the last one at 43. At 45, I decided it was time to take up writing. It was time to slay the dragon. So when I was in Singapore, I knew a journalist, and I was always very enamoured with his job and that kind of life. And it never occurred to me that I could do that job, although I dreamed that I could have. I could never decide if I loved writing or photography more. So at 45, I decided now would be a good time with the 1, 3 and 10-year-old children to go and do go to uni, which I'd never done, and do a diploma in professional writing and editing. The day I had my first, the day I started uni was the day I had my first story published. So I was lucky enough to get work with Outback magazine, some farming magazines. But it didn't take me long to sort of drift towards aviation. The lecturer said to me, "Are you going to write about flying?" And I said, "No," because I was surrounded by experts. You see, I'm surrounded by all these commercial pilots. And I just felt as a private pilot that I was what would I have to share? But I met a girlfriend at that time who was a journalist, and she had been a finance writer. And I said, "How do you know what to write? Have you got a degree in finance or something?" And she said, "No, but she said, I know who to ask." And I thought, right, so that totally changed things. That was the game changer. So I started writing aviation, and eventually somebody suggested to me that I should write a book on women pilots. And again, I thought, I don't know if I'm qualified for that. And I said, "Why do you think I should be the one to write that?" And she said, "Because you are one." And I thought, "Oh, fair enough." So off I went. I took about 4 or 5 or 6 months to get started on the book. It's 10 Australian women, so it's true stories based on a timeline starting in the 30s with Nancy Bird, and it goes right through to the modern day. So 7 of the 10 women are still alive and 5 of them are still flying. So some people think it's a history book, but it has a historical aspect to it, but it's really just a book of what I felt were really great stories. So to write a book on women pilots, I decided I absolutely had to have this girl, Georgia Maxwell. She was the cover girl. She is the cover girl. She's in her early 40s now, and she's sitting there on the wing of an air tractor, AT-802, which is the largest single engine firebomber and ag plane in the world. And so not only did I love that picture, but I loved Georgia's story because I'd interviewed her for Outback magazine and we'd done a podcast together. But I didn't want to go crashing into her life again and say, "Can I do another story on you?" And so I just wanted to sit with the idea for a while until I could get a handle on it, you know. So I had Georgia and Nancy Bird. So most people know Nancy Bird. She was the first Australian woman to get to use her commercial license. So she was about number 7 or 11 or something to get a commercial license in Australia, but she was the first one to use it. So the 3rd Sydney Airport is about to be named after Nancy Bird. There's the airport terminal at Burke. There's roads, control tower, university, you know, stuff written about her. There's books, there's lectures, there's everything. Nancy Bird's kind of everywhere, but it's quite justified because she became the role model for women in aviation. And she set up the Women Pilots Association in the 50s, and they're about to name the 3rd Sydney Airport after her. So I felt that she was quite important to know about. So I had Nancy and Georgia, and then I still didn't know where to start. I thought 2's not enough. And I went to the 2016 Australian Women Pilots Conference, and I met a lady called Patricia Toole. And Pat was 88 at that time. The fabulous thing about the Women Pilots Conference is there's everybody from 16-year-old students to 18-year-old commercial pilots to 60, 70-year-old students. I met a woman in the Broken Hill at the last conference in March. She was in her 70s and she was learning to fly. And, you know, she was there with us. There was airline pilots, Air Force pilots, me. There was anybody and everybody. So it's a fantastic group. And I've really, really enjoyed being part of it since I rejoined about in 2016. So Pat was there, and at 88, she got up on the stage to give a talk, and she was quite an unassuming looking lady. She just marched up there quite matter-of-factly and started speaking in a very low, slow, you know, no-nonsense sort of way. And it didn't take long for me to realise that this was a hell of a story that she was telling. She had been the first female pilot in New Guinea, and she flew up there in 52 and 53. So Pat grew up in Coffs Harbour. She around New South Wales, but she ended up in Coffs Harbour, and she saw a DC-3 descend into the airport, and she thought, I'm going to have a go at that. So she actually was running her father's hairdressing salons, and her brother was at uni, and so she was supporting the family. Her parents were unwell at the time, and her brother was at uni, so she was kind of supporting everybody with this two hairdressing salons. And she just felt that once he graduated, it was time to do something for herself. So she did. She went and got a commercial license, and by that time, her brother had got a job in New Guinea, and the owner of a small airline said, you know, he was lamenting the fact that it was just after the war, and none of the wartime pilots wanted to come back up and fly in New Guinea. He was flying freight and people out to the hard to get to places, the mission stations, and flying these little airplanes around these impossible mountains, hidden behind clouds into slippery little strips that go straight up, and with instructions like, when you get to the gap in the mountains, don't turn left there because that's a false gap. Keep going, and then you take the next one. When you find that hill, you look down and come around the hill, and that's where you land. So even today, New Guinea is still a treacherous place for aviators. So Pat, with her brand new license, went up to New Guinea, and she hooked into it. The first story she told was, she said, I arrived at the airport and there was nobody there to meet me. They'd forgotten I was coming. So she was in her own uniform. They said to her, you know, women in the 50s, they didn't have pilots' uniforms. Even in the 70s, when Deborah Laurie started work with Ansett, she had to wear men's clothes because there was no women pilots' uniforms. So Pat had her own uniform. She had a men's shirt with the epaulets. She had a pair of culottes that she'd had made, and she wore shoes and socks like the men. She got to Port Moresby. No one was there. She sorted that out, and a few days later, she went off on her first flight, and they were going to fly from Port Moresby up through across the Kokoda track to Popondetta, which is the other side of the Kokoda Gap through the mountains. When she got in the airplane, they took off from Jackson Strip, which is the main airport in Port Moresby, and air traffic control called them up and said, do you realise you're on fire? And she said no. So they had to turn around and come straight back. So that was welcome to New Guinea. So about a week later, that she was summoned to Wewak, which was the maintenance base up on the north coast of New Guinea. So her and the chief pilot hopped in a different airplane and flew up to Wewak. She got out of the plane at Wewak, and all the men were lined up to see who this new female pilot was. And she said they had a bet that I was an old bat. They thought, you know, being a woman in this man's role, she'd have to be a tough old bird. But she wasn't. She was only 23. And it's my husband in the tractor, maybe. I thought he was going to come crashing through my Zoom. He's been threatened with death if he interrupts me. Pat was not an old bat. She was only 23. She had, I imagine, fabulous hair because she'd been a hairdresser, and she's quite tall. So I imagine the long legs of this slim 23-year-old blonde stepping out of the aeroplane. And one of them nudged the boss, and he said, what are you going to do with her? And he said, I think I'll marry her, of course, marry her, of course. And so they did a little while later. But she was a bit slow to the uptake on that, because she said, I've come here to fly. I'm a pilot, and you know, she was pursuing her career. But they did get married. So I heard Pat's story. I'll read you an extract from that later. And I was so sold at the end of the, halfway through her talk, I put down my drink, I picked up my camera and went right up to the front of the room and sat exactly, you know, in that front row where nobody wants to sit. And I sat there with my camera and couldn't believe these tales that just kept coming, you know. Another one was they got to Wewak, and yes, the boss said, marry her, of course, but then they got sent out on a job that same day. She'd only just arrived and then took off again. She said, we got up over the mountains and the propeller came sharply into view. And when you consider what that means, is she said the engine had stopped dead. And So they had to do a forced landing onto a mountain top. She said it was a 10-minute flight out there and a 10-hour walk home. So those stories just kept coming for about 45 minutes. So I knew that I was listening to something extremely special. So when she came back, we happened to be sitting at the same table, and I said to her, I've been thinking about writing this book, and would you like to be in it? And she went, yeah. At 88, she thought, oh, that'd be great fun. So she was all for it, this great adventure, the next adventure. So we had a few conversations, and then I was meant to go and see her in Brisbane 3 weeks later, and she passed away a week before I got there. So I was very sad to have that happen. And so then I was completely committed. So I thought, right, I've got to start for the book. I've got an amazing story. And given what's just transpired, I feel obliged to tell her story. So I spent 8 months writing Pat's story, and I worked with somebody to figure out how to write like I'm writing a book as opposed to writing a magazine article. So 800 words had to become 7,000, and that took a bit of working out. So I did Pat's, then I spent 3 months doing Nancy Bird's story. I went and met her family and interviewed people that knew her. I'd met her as well. When I had first got my license, I met her at a dinner in Sydney. She was delightful, very, very short and big, bright, smiley eyes. So I wrote Nancy's, and then I called Georgia and said, any chance you want to be part of this next mad idea? And thankfully she agreed. And so Georgia was an ag pilot from Canada, and she flew for 16 years. And she finished up flying the fire bombers. So that airplane she's sitting on was during the fire season. She's actually pregnant in that photo. And she had some amazing tales of flying under a wire, just the training that she did to be able to work as an ag pilot. Anybody who's watched an ag pilot fly will understand it's quite dramatic, quite a dramatic way to earn your living, and takes an enormous amount of skill and courage, a lot of courage. And so I was very privileged to have Georgia on the team. So after Georgia, that was 3, and I ended up writing 9 stories. And anyone who's read the book will now be saying, sure, there was 10. I found, I met Gabby Kenner. So anybody who was around in the 80s might remember this fabulous lady, Gabby Kenner, who decided that she needed to make some sense of her life and to regain some control. And so she found a babysitter for the children. She drew back on her mortgage. She bought herself an aeroplane and got a small team around her, and she took off. She said to the husband, who was about to, they were about to part ways, and she said, I'm going around the world. I'll see when I get back. So she was meant to go for 33 days, and she was gone for 99. And that's an incredible tale of bravery, of deciding to embark on this amazing journey. She was the first Australian woman to do it, and she flew in a single engine aeroplane. So you've only got one engine to do the long haul. She flew up to Cairns, New Guinea, where she got robbed of all her survival gear. So she then had to replace it with quite inferior life jacket and radio beacons, all that stuff that you need to fly across water. So she flew to the Majuro Islands, onto Hawaii, California, across the US, down to South America, across the Atlantic through thunder and lightning, the most horrendous thunderstorm you can imagine. She got to Africa, very shaken up after that Atlantic flight. She then got dysentery and was there for a week and thought, if I don't get out of here, I'm going to die in this place. So I think somebody took her out to the airport and just sort of poured her into this hot aeroplane, and she flew off and went to Tunisia, through the Middle East and down through Asia, and finally home into Darwin and back down to Sydney. It was an epic journey with an enormous amount of challenges, the last one being in Singapore, where she had gone off. She put the aeroplane in to get serviced, and she went off to meet some sponsors and do some business. And when she got back, they said to her, "Yeah, everything's okay. Where'd you pick up that snake?" And this snake, I can't remember if she said she can't remember if it was bright green or bright yellow, had come out from, I think it was from under the instrument panel on the dash, or it might have been from under the fuel tanks or something, and ran down the engineer's leg and escaped into a monsoon drain. And she said the engineer didn't care to discuss it any further. So that would have been enough, I think, for me to call it a day. But anyway, she kept going. And that's how it went. Gabby's still around. She's up on the central coast of New South Wales, and she's just delightful. We had a lovely long chat the other day. And she said, "Oh, yeah, there's a lot of stuff I missed when I was writing her story in the interview process." She said, "Oh, yeah, I went ballooning, and yes, I went skydiving." And I'm like, she said, "Oh," she was in her 60s, and she said, "We're in New Zealand doing a hike." And I said, "Oh, we should do that bungee thing while we're here." So she went bungee jumping. And I said, "Gabby, I can't believe I missed all that." So there was almost like I need to write another book and add all the bits that I missed out on. So yeah, but she's very quietly spoken and very gentle sort of lady, lovely lady. She reminds me of Meryl Streep in looks and the way she speaks. So yeah, I met Gabby and she agreed, and I thought, wow, that's a big thing. And then Deborah Laurie, who was Deborah Wardley in 1978. Deb took Reg Ansett to court, so anyone in Melbourne who was around in 78 or 79 should remember that case where Reg Ansett said, "No woman will ever step foot in my cockpit." And Deb said, "Well, we'll see about that." So she was 25, and the Equal Opportunity Board had just been set up to enact the Sex Discrimination Act. And so Deborah was the test case for that. Faye Miles, who was the Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, said afterwards, that case went on for over 12 months. She said, "If we hadn't won that case, I can't imagine a case that we could win, because the discrimination was so clear cut, where this guy just said, not having it, not having a woman in the cockpit." So anyway, Deb did. She won it, went all the way to the High Court. She was with Ansett for 10 years. And then during the pilot's dispute, she lost her job as well, and she went to Holland. She went and flew for KLM City Hopper. They were Holland was the only country where they would take an Australian, like where she could get a visa, and would employ a woman pilot. So go the Dutch. And Deb worked over there for about 15 or 16 years, was a single mother with a son. And then now she's back in Australia. She's only just finished flying last year because of COVID, like so many of the pilots. And she's doing other things now. Every time I contact her, she's either at a lecture or doing a flight with someone. I'm not sure what she's up to, but she's still quite active. She became very interested in safety. So Deb has certainly given a lot back to the industry that was so hard to get into. It's a very different welcome home when she came back and went for the interview with, I think it was Virgin or Tiger or somebody, Virgin. And yeah, they welcomed her with open arms, and she said, "Boy, this is different to the last time." So getting Gabby and Deb was, to me, I thought, wow, I've really got the rock stars now, because I was very nervous approaching both of them, but thrilled to also have their stories in the book. So then I looked around for the rest. I only had 3 more spots left. I came across Marianne Mccall. Marianne was about 50 when she had 5 kids, and she was married to a bishop, and they lived in South Australia, out in the country. And he spent his weeks travelling hundreds, thousands of kilometres. And when her last child was about to leave home, her friends said to her, "What are you going to do, Marianne? You're only 50. And she said, it'd be really useful if I could fly, and then I could fly my husband to all these places where he has to go, and I could go with him, and we could, be a team. So they did a fundraiser, and the people of the diocese threw money at it, and Marianne got her license. So she did 15, how many hours? There's a couple or a few thousand hours, which is quite a lot at 50 to amass that many hours. But when they went to West Australia, he became the Bishop of Bunbury, and Marianne entered the Dawn to Dusk Challenge, which is set up by Prince Philip. And because Prince Philip was a pilot, and he liked the idea, and a sporting man, and he liked the idea of this challenge where pilots were encouraged to demonstrate their skill rather than speed. So Marianne won it. She won this competition. She went to London to the Royal Air Force Club in Piccadilly, which was very posh and very lovely. And she got the first prize trophy, which she had to cart home. It's worth £12,500, donated by the Duke of Edinburgh. And it was a tiger moth compass, a World War II tiger moth compass with a Waterford crystal dome. So she brought it home and kept it under the bed. And I said, I don't know who's going to dive under the bishop's bed looking for crystals, so it's probably a good place to hide it. But she, a few years later, she was contacted by one of the judges. And he said, I've just had lunch with Prince Philip at Buckingham Palace. And he said, did you get that Australian woman to defend her title? So Marianne went back and she won it. She won it 3 times, actually. So I just felt Marianne's was a great story of learning to fly later in age and the things that can happen when you take that first step. If she hadn't learned to fly, she never would have had those achievements. She was awarded an OAM a few years ago. So Marianne's a great story. Then Lynn Gray. Now, Lynn Gray was suggested to me as a very dramatic story. And as soon as I heard the first line, I went, that's it, I have to have that one. Lynn Gray flew, she imported aircraft. So when I said in the 70s, my dad and others were flying in Cessnas and Pipers, Lynn was and people like her, Jim Hazelton, Ray Clambach. So Lynn was working for Ray Clambach. They were importing airplanes, Aminta Hennessy, his wife, importing airplanes from the US. And so they'd put extra large fuel tanks in the back to give them the endurance. And so Lynn was bringing one of these airplanes across, and they had a problem and had to shut down one engine, and she ended up having to ditch in the ocean. So her story was quite a delicate one to write. It was only 10 years ago that happened, and I was very aware that that's a traumatic event that she was not always thrilled to talk about. And so I was very excited and honoured to be allowed to tell that story, but did try to tread very carefully through it. So I got Lynn's version of events, her co-pilot and the 2 pilots in the other airplane, because they were flying together. And then one went down and one had to keep going onto Hawaii. There's lots of newspaper articles about it. So I'm quite proud of that story. So that's story number 6. Go straight to story number 6 and then come back and start the book. So I didn't actually meet Lynn until after the book had gone to the printer, before it had come in that no man's land, that time before it comes out. And that's when we met. And I thought, gee, I hope I've got this right, But I went down to Tullamarine and we had some noodles on a plastic chair at an Asian restaurant somewhere. And she was exactly as she had been on the phone. And I was quite relieved about that. Then it was somewhere in amongst all that, I went to another Women Pilots Conference and met Nicole Forrester. She also gave a talk, the way Pat had. Nicole is now about 32 or 33, and she talked about learning to fly in Brisbane. She got failed on her first flight test, and she had to pick herself up and go back and have another go at it. But she pushed on, and she ended up, rather than going to the airlines, she said, I want to go and work on a cattle station. I want to go and cut my teeth in the outback, she'd never been to a cattle station. She had no idea what a cattle station looked or sounded like, but she just knew that's what she wanted to do. So she, to her surprise, got a job, and she went out to this cattle station. And to hear her talk about it, she laughed about herself. She was poking fun at herself about the sights and the sounds and the smells and the clothes and the place and the people, and how she was just like an alien plonked in this foreign landscape out in the middle of the Northern Territory. And she was such a city girl from Brisbane. So I finished the book and I sent it off to the publisher and thought, glad that's done. That only took 4 years, 3.5 or 4 years. And the publisher came back and said, this is all very well, Kathy. Any chance you could get one more? I said, one more what? And she said, just one more story. And I couldn't believe my ears. I thought, you're joking, aren't you? But she said, you know, because 9 Australian women pilots, sounds like you can't find 10. And I thought, okay. So, and they said, if you could make it an RFDS story, that would be good. So that was a bit of a task, but I checked in with the network and up popped Esther Veldstra. Esther is, I don't know, put your hand up, Esther, if you're online at the moment. She might be in this meeting. Esther's Dutch. She grew up in Holland and she came to Australia with her parents, got her license, and then drove off into the outback and went looking for work. And her story, I thought, was going to be about the drama and excitement of flying for the RFDS, but actually it was the lead up to getting that job that was full of drama. And I said to Esther, I could have taken any one part of your story and made 7,000 words out of it. But there was so much that happened. It was a bit like Pat Toole. It was just like, The story is meant to go stasis, crisis, resolution. Well, Esther's went like this. So, but she finally did get her dream job at the RFDS, and I think did a pretty good job, did a great job of it for the 14 years that she was there. She also became a single mother of twin girls who are now about 13, I think. And anyone who's been a single mother knows what a job that is. Anyone who's become a pilot knows what a job that is. So all cheers to Esther for managing to pull that one off. So I'm sick of my voice, and that's been half an hour. Is there anybody there?
We might open up to some questions now, Kathy. Yeah. I think we can all agree that that was very inspiring. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? You can unmute yourself to ask them, or feel free to send them through to me in the chat.
Nobody there. They've all gone home.
Hey, Kathy, it's Bronnie.
Oh, Bronnie.
I just wanted to say,
yeah,
now. I just wanted to say, great talk. Thank you. It's really great to hear about the backstories of your writing, and the backstories of all the stories, because I've read the book and there's still more. It's amazing to hear how there's still so much more detail behind it. I don't think I can ever get sick of hearing you talk about this, actually. You've got so much knowledge and just so many great stories, isn't there? So
yeah,
good.
That's funny. Bronnie is the editor of Air News, which is the Australian Women Pilots Association magazine. You got one handy?
That's my recent one.
So we have lots of chats, magazine chats, but Bronnie's quite young, as you can see, young and gorgeous, and just got your commercial balloon pilot's license. Is that right?
I'm working on my private license at the moment, and hopefully we'll have my commercial about this time next year.
And got a fantastic scholarship this year at the conference. The Women
yes.
Pilot. What was the scholarship for?
It was from Air Services Australia and the Australian Women Pilots Association, and it was for flight training to finish my commercial pilot's license for fixed wing. So I'm currently working on that as well. I'm grounded with that at the moment. I can't do my flying training because of COVID, but that's okay. That's sitting there ready for summer to pounce and finish. I don't have that much left to do, so hopefully I should have that by May next year. Yeah. I thought I'd get in and do my balloon one now while I've got this gap, you know. So, yeah.
Fabulous.
But thank you very much. It's so great to see you.
That's okay. was a great story on the ABC last week.
Oh yeah, they did an amazing job, didn't they? It was really good. Yeah. Hopefully everybody else can get in the air soon too.
The ABC did a story on Bronnie and her instructor, was it?
Yeah, my friend
about
Georgia.
Women in ballooning, how there's only 5 female commercial balloon pilots in Australia. And
Well,
I think 2 of them are
6 now. Yeah. But
2 of them are in my next book. So.
Yeah. Well, it's really funny because once I get mine, and then there's also another girl, Mia Fraser, who's sort of grown up in ballooning too, and she's ready to do hers. So we might have to recheck the statistics soon because we could be taking over.
Yeah.
It's really exciting. By this time next year, we should have at least 7. Yeah. All right.
Has anybody got any flying questions or writing questions?
I've got a few that have just come through in the chat. I've got one that says, did Reg Ansett change his mind?
No, he didn't. It went to the High Court, and the High Court, so the court case went from the Equal Opportunity Board to the Supreme Court, back to the Equal Opportunity Board, back to the Supreme Court, and then up to the High Court. And the High Court ruled 4-2, I think, and Deborah won. And so they were forced to take her on. And she was not welcomed with open arms. The younger guys were quite happy to have her, but there was a big anti-female pilot sentiment. Reg Ansett actually stepped down from the board of Ansett the day of the High Court decision, and he was about 70 then, and he was experiencing ill health by then, and I think he passed away a couple of years later, a year or 2 later. So no, he never backed down. He called her that wretched woman, I think. Nice.
Very lovely, isn't it?
Hard to believe, actually. Hard to believe in this day and age, but
definitely.
It wasn't that long ago.
I've got another question that's come through here as well. You mentioned that someone helped you to figure out how to write for a book rather than for magazines. Who was that?
Yeah. Well, there's Kristen Alexander is a friend of mine who's an author, so you should Google her. She's a beautiful writer, and I bounced off her a fair bit in the beginning, and I remember her coming back to me and she said, oh, Kathy, I thought it was Pat Till's story. I started off saying they couldn't decide what to do with her, so they gave her a gun. I thought that was a really dramatic start, the story. And she said, who, what gun, who, she said, this is not how you start a book. This is how you start a magazine article. So Kristen was very good. And then I had an editor in Melbourne who spent a lot of time with me, and another friend, Annabelle Brayley, and she has written about 6 or 7 books, mainly about medical people in the bush. And she was excellent as well, because I was kind of following her style.
I've got another question that's come through. Do you think it became easier for women in the flight industry? If not, what would need to change? And maybe so you could tell us a bit about any challenges you have overcome as well.
Me? My problem perhaps is that I've lost confidence by being around the men, men showing off. That's one of the problems. No, maybe not showing off is not the right word. Men just fly differently to women, and I think once I had children and the responsibilities that come with that, then I did lose confidence. And once I got my license, I never really consolidated it, because I immediately, I got my license, and the next 2 days later I went off to be with Dennis. And I used to fly out at Lord Howe Island. I'd just get in the Cessna and fly around, but over the years it became less and less. Every time I went to get my license going again, I'd fall pregnant, and then I'd lose that baby, and then I'd go back to flying, and then it went on and on all through my 30s. So, but now that the youngest is about to leave school, I feel very excited that we've got an airplane in there and it's being put back together. So I'm really looking forward to that. But what was the question? Oh, is it hard for women? Definitely after Deborah Laurie, there was another, Felicity Bush went and joined ANZET, but it took a good, I think, 10 years until TAA, the government airline, employed a woman. The Air Force didn't have women pilots until 1988. The Qantas, they took in some, I think around the same time as TAA, I'm not sure about that. But now it's very different. It's still a small percentage of women. It's about 6% of pilots are women, but there's a lot more young women around the airfields, now. Especially with these aviation degrees, the girls seem to feel more comfortable doing that. Nicole in the Air Force said there still needs to be more in the Air Force to give them some mass. She talked about how much easier it is for women if there's other women in the same flight training group. She said even if you've got one standout candidate and two really bad candidates, she said they'll all do a lot better by being grouped together than having just one in with all the boys. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Thank you for that. I've got another one here that's come through. There were women pilots who fly in combat now. I remember hearing a story years ago that they were only allowed to train other pilots but couldn't go into combat.
I don't know the answer to that. My son is in the Air Force, but I don't talk to him about women pilots. I talked to Nicole, actually, because Nicole, the girl on the cattle station, she did join the Air Force in the end. Yeah. Is there pay equity for women? Yes, everyone gets paid the same. I think, I don't know. I'm not a commercial pilot, so I don't work in the industry. But I know with, airlines and military, they have to pay them properly, don't they?
Fantastic. And how long did it take you to get your license, or if there was anyone here who wanted to, I guess, sort of pursue that kind of path? What maybe you or Bronnie might be able to speak to a little bit about that.
I just went. So there's a lot more. It's a lot more confusing these days, I think. But I just went to a flying school and handed over the cash. So you just walk in and say, "Hi, I'd like to fly," and they'll say, "Sit down," and I'll have a chat. And they'll usually take you for a trial introductory flight, and that is quite cheap because flying lessons, I think, are about $300 an hour, but a TIF is about $200 or $250 or $230 or something. And that's just basically what my father did, which is where you go up in the plane and they explain the effects of the controls and let you have a steer, and after that you'll know whether you want to do it or not, because it's not for everybody. And if it's not what you want to be doing, it's absolutely not the place to be, because it takes full commitment. So I did my restricted license over one winter. I think it took 30 hours, and normally I'd fly 2 hours a week. And then I did my unrestricted the following winter. But if you wanted to just go somewhere like Lynn Gray, the lady who ditched in the ocean, she has a flying school now at Cowra, and the weather's quite good there, and you can go up there and knock the whole thing over in a couple of months, 3 months if you wanted to.
Someone just asked, is there a minimum number of flying hours you need?
I think Bronnie might be more up to the speed with that than me. You still there, Bronnie?
Yeah, I am. There's a few stages to the license, as you were saying, Kathy. There's the restricted license, which is sort of like a hobby license. It means that you can be licensed to fly solo and take passengers within an area that's sort of 25 nautical miles of your airport, and that's called the restricted. That's a minimum of 25 hours dual with an instructor and 5 solo, I think, before you do your test. And then after that, you can do your navigation training. That's another 25 to 30 hours now. And that means you can get your private license, which you can fly anywhere in Australia. You're unrestricted up to a certain size of aircraft. And New Guinea, that's right.
And New Guinea. I was a bit surprised when I saw that on my license. I thought, well, but I want to go to New Guinea.
Yeah, well, you can even use it to go over to New Zealand and that as well. The paperwork is what stops most people, I think. But yeah, there's those stages. Once you have your private license, you can get that in about 60 hours. And then if you want to go into commercial, it's about 200 minimum. and 100 of
So
those have to be in command.
When you start flying, an hour a week or 2 hours a week is plenty. And then once you get into it, towards the end, you can go every day. Like I remember going every day or twice a day for like a week straight before I did my test.
In fact, it's really beneficial if you can do that. Yeah, the more often you can fly, especially when you're starting out, will set you up to be so much more of a confident and safe pilot than if you sort of stretch it out, especially at the beginning.
It's about currency, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, and consistency, yeah.
Any others?
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, if anyone else has any other questions, yeah, feel free to ask them or send them through. Otherwise, Kathy, did you want to maybe do the selected reading that you had chosen?
Yeah. Has anybody read the book? That's a good one to ask.
I've got one person who said that they've just placed a reservation in the catalogue, and I'm going to speak to our collections manager about getting some more copies.
Okay. Is there anybody who, well, I've told you about everybody in it. Is there anybody who's extract you'd like me to read?
Perhaps you could read whatever one is your favourite or whichever one inspires you the most. I think a lot of these stories, for me anyway, have been very inspiring to listen to. Someone has just said Nancy Bird.
Nancy Bird learnt to fly in Sydney at Charles Kingsford Smith's flying school. She did her first two lessons with Smithy, and then she was taught by one of his instructors. And then Nancy bought an aeroplane and she went off around New South Wales doing barnstorming. So she took her friend Peg Kelman, who was a little bit older and a little bit more experienced pilot, and they did 2 trips around New South Wales, and they were barnstorming is where it's kind of like busking, you know, where you just turn up and hang out your flag and your shingle and start doing your thing, you know, juggling or singing or whatever. But when you're in an aeroplane, you hang out your shingle and give joy flights or do a performance. So after Nancy did those 2 barnstorming trips, while she was on the second one, she met a guy who invited her out to Bourke to fly the clinic sister on her nursing rounds. So it was a 120-mile circuit from Bourke, which is pretty lost and lonely country out there, especially in the 30s and late 20s, early 30s. She had just a busted up old road map that didn't really tell her much. Her main navigation aid was the telegraph line. But beyond the telegraph line was just the vast interior. And so she'd often stop at stations and ask directions from the station owners. But when she went out there and during the second barnstorming tour, she went and did a trial. Then they finished the tour, went home, and then Nancy went back by herself to start this contract. And Sister Webb was the nursing sister, and she wasn't too keen on getting in this newfangled contraption. You have to remember that she was in a gypsy moth, leopard moth by that time, which was an aircraft. They're very light. They get thrown around in the heat quite a lot, and it's very hot. And the hotter it is, the more turbulent the flying. So it was some pretty rough days out there, hot and uncomfortable. So the nervous Sister Webb was coaxed back into the aeroplane on the assurance that the leopard moth would be vastly more comfortable than the gypsy. But the summer heat and resulting turbulence did little to reduce her distaste for flight. By Christmas, a permanent clinic was established in Bourke, staffed by Margot Silver, Sister Silver, which left Sister Webb to live out her days on more agreeable earthly adventures that didn't involve flying. Nancy embarked on a regular clinic round from Bourke to Louth, Urissino, Hungerford, Yantabulla, Ford's Bridge, and back to Bourke. I've never been to those places, but I'd love to go. My friend was driving through there recently and I said, send me some photos. It was a loop of about 200 kilometres that arced out west of Bourke. The motoring maps from the men at the local garage weren't very accurate, and so a positive position fix often meant landing at a station to ask directions. Without obvious landmarks like rivers or mountains, Nancy was reduced to navigating along the overland telegraph line, a single wire on a single line of posts with a clearing either side and just about the right width to land safely if required. So she could see the telegraph wire, it was the only landmark, and there was enough clearing either side to put the aeroplane down. Without radio, the only way to call for help was to scale a post and cut the telegraph wire, then spend a day or two on emergency rations while waiting for a telegraph linesman to show up looking for the fault that the pilot had just created. It was a rudimentary fallback, but at least it brought hope of rescue within a few days. Thankfully, Nancy never had an accident or an emergency. Yeah, I will read you the end of her story because what was lovely about Nancy's story is that I was very nervous writing about her because she's a bit of a rock star, you know, so, and a lot of people have hold her in extremely high regard. And so I was fearful that I'd get it wrong and cop the backlash. But I got some really lovely feedback from the people who knew her, and that was really nice. So when she lived until she was 93. And on her 90th birthday, Qantas announced that they would name their first Airbus A380 the Nancy Bird Walton. While Nancy's legacy seems disproportionate to her actual flying achievements, because she only flew commercially for those 3 years, it isn't just the power of publicity that makes her a household name. As longtime family friend and fellow aviator Dick Smith confirmed, what Nancy did in the 30s, alone in those conditions and in the face of male prejudice, was remarkable. And standing firmly atop her pioneer pedestal, Nancy used her greatest skill, public relations, to set up the rest of her life. She was available in Sydney for speaking engagements or other opportunities, and she used her connections to make things happen. She'd also seen the evolution of aviation from rudimentary biplanes, because remember, she started flying just after the First World War, right through to the most sophisticated Airbus. And when delivering a speech, she could recall those transitions with good humour and great clarity. In September 2008, Captain Elise Fordham gently splintered a bottle of champagne across the hull of Qantas's first A380, christening it the Nancy Bird Walton. Sporting her trademark triple strand of pearls, the 93-year-old guest of honour sat through CEO Jeff Dixon's 2-minute speech, where he applauded her courage, resilience and optimism. She then stood at the podium to make her own speech. This made me laugh, and she said, "Fortunately, I couldn't hear all that. I'm sure it was exaggerated," she said. Qantas announced that they'd named this magnificent aircraft after me on my 90th birthday 3 years ago. "I've made it my business to stay alive for today's ceremony, and I've made it," she said, animatedly. 3 months later, the same Airbus did a low and slow pass over Nancy's funeral in Sydney. Inside, her granddaughter spoke of our mum, our nan, our friend, our Nancy, a dearly loved member of our family who led us with the grace of a glider and the determination of a jet fighter. Interspersed among the crowd were pink outfits, accessorised with strings of pearls, Nancy's favourite combination, worn by women pilots, the Women Pilots Association members, because Nancy founded that organisation. These women continue to benefit from the organisation that was then 58 years old. Its senior commercial airline and RAF members now enjoy comfort in the cockpit beyond the wildest imaginings of the young Nancy Bird, who had to ask the station workers to remove a fence so she could take off from an isolated barren paddock in the outback. Nancy would have loved their life, but she was too far ahead of her time. Yeah. So that's Nancy. That's how much we love her.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. Does anybody have any other questions that they'd like to ask of Kathy?
Is anybody still there?
Yes, there's definitely at least a few of us still here. I'm also just going to pop a link in the chat for everyone as well for the catalogue record for Kathy's book. So if you'd like to reserve a copy from the library, and I'll put in a request for us to get a few more copies there as well.
I think you should write another book, Kathy.
Oh, I've started. I haven't started yet, but I will.
The pressure is on.
One of the women in it just had a crash. So,
oh, wow.
Anyway, I will just read this last bit of Pat Toole's story. Bronnie, you remember Pat Toole? Did you meet her?
No, I missed that conference and I'm going to regret it forever because I've heard so much about that specific talk. Moved so many people. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So Pat Toole, the last event that happened in her career was she was flying, she was in New Guinea from Wewak. She was flying along the coast to drop off some supplies, doing a freight run. And she was coming home and she got caught in cloud, and because in the jungle, the cloud rises so quickly. And she got caught out in this cloud and she had to do a forced landing. She finally found a hole in the cloud and spiraled down through the cloud and landed on a riverbed in this razorback jungle. So it was absolutely remarkable testament to her flying and her calm head that she was able to hold it together long enough and then take that opportunity when she saw the hole in the cloud, and to put the aeroplane down on a riverbed without damaging much. She hit a rock and that knocked off one of the wheels, the legs, and the wingtip and the propeller tip were damaged. But basically, she put it down and they were able to carry it out a few days later, I mean. But this is her rescue, which was the bit that I absolutely fell for. So she'd been out there for quite a while, 40 hours. She'd been out there getting eaten by mosquitoes. A dedicated young government patrol officer walked into the small village later that evening looking for the crashed aeroplane. Well, he thought he was. Just as Pat had received the water and the rations from the sky, so a dragon, which is a Qantas Dragon aeroplane, had found her and they'd dropped some water and some supplies. And the supplies included some inedible food, water, some cigarettes, a Luger pistol and a bottle of rum. So I think a man must have packed that. Where were the sandwiches? Just as Pat had received the water and rations from the sky, the search party in the Dragon had flown on and dropped a rudimentary map with a circle that said, "Proceed to the scene of the crash." And he thought, well, hello, what's this mean? What was the pistol for? We don't know. They decided that being a woman alone, she was actually meant to carry a gun with her when she flew. They wanted to stop her from flying, and she said, no, I've got a commercial license. I've been doing the job for, 2 years, and why am I any different? I think it was for protection. But she'd left her gun at home that day. Bad day at work, Bronnie, isn't it, when you get in your plane and fly off without your pistol?
Yeah, I hate it when that happens, quite frankly. It's the worst. Also, it's very illegal.
Yeah. Proceed to the scene of the crash. The circle covered about 300 square kilometres of forbidding jungle. With this scant information, the patrol officer made an educated guess and set out at about lunchtime from his post at Drekakia. The villagers informed him that the pilot was female and some miles down the ever-expanding river, because remember it was raining, it was bad weather that forced her down. The officer, a stocky Australian who'd been partly raised in New Guinea, was used to walking for days on patrol in this country, and without hesitation, he continued overland into the night with his 3 local police assistants. They hacked their way down the last few kilometres of steep and slippery jungle at around 10 p.m. When he fired a couple of shots into the deep night to signal his approach, Pat replied with a couple of rounds from the Luger, which she'd only just learned how to load and fire. But her shots echoed from the steep canyon walls unheard. Through teeming rain, she stared into the blackness and waited. Eventually, a hurricane lantern lit the very welcome face of the 21-year-old patrol officer, Jock McGregor. I love that name. As soon as she said that, I was like, oh, I have to tell this story. That was the light bulb moment, Jock McGregor. They introduced themselves, and then Pat, rising to the occasion, turned to her new friend and inquired, Jock, would you like a rum? Oh, he exclaimed, I walk for 8 hours in the jungle. I find a woman alive and she offers me rum. You bloody beaut. So there they were. He was 21, she was 23, 25, I think, by then. The police assistants erected a grass shelter as Pat and Jock crouched under the aeroplane wing. Precious rum splashed into a couple of pannikins, 5 glugs each. And as Jock rested his feet, I think that's another earthquake. Just feel a tremor? As Jock rested his feet, Pat handled the drinks and began her debrief. Oblivious to the mosquitoes and the river rocks, they finished the bottle and fell into a relieved sleep around 3 a.m. Pat had been out there for 40 hours. I love Pat too. I think you'd be all sick of me by now. Is there anything else?
I could listen to those stories all day. One person had asked, what was the pistol for?
The pistol, yeah, so Cecile is spellbound. I can read you the rest of that story, the end of the story, if you like. The pistol was, well, the Department of Civil Aviation came to WEWAC and said to her boss, you've got a woman flying over the uncontrolled territories, which is where they feared that there were cannibal tribes. And they said, if she comes down there, you know, she's going to be in a hell of a spot. But she said, you know, that's ridiculous. What's the difference in me or a man? We're still just flying the plane. So he wanted her not to fly unless she had a man with her. And she said, well, that defeats the purpose of having me when the guy could just fly by himself. And so she just said, I'm not going to stop flying. And they, in the end, decided that she'd carry a gun for protection. Yeah. So I thought it was quite funny when they dropped her the Luger. There is one part just before that where she was on the river. I'll read you that bit too, because she told me this in those precious couple of days that we had together. So they dropped her the rum, dropped her the package. No sooner, so she opened the rum was the last thing that came up. And she thought with a grin, now you're talking. It was hardly top shelf, but what the hell. No sooner had Pat started smiling at the rum than the smile was wiped right off her face. She froze as she looked up the river bend and movements slowly morphed into the shapes of men. She quietly picked up the Luger and put it in her pocket and watched, trembling, as the group advanced. Not 2, not 10, not 20. She wasn't sure how many there were, but it felt like 100 or 200 naked men, armed with spears, axes, and bows and arrows approaching her. As she awaited her fate, they came close enough for Pat to see the whites of their teeth, because, thank God, the front ones were smiling. She relaxed her grip on the Luger, fixed a smile of her own, and advanced to greet the group, shaking hands with each and every one. They were from the village that she'd spotted on the way down and had come to investigate the aerial activity. They invited her to go back to the village with them, but she thought it better to stay with the aircraft as it was clearly visible for the search party. Their offer of hospitality refused, the villagers quickly dispersed, keen to get home before nightfall. They didn't like the night. Pat returned to the aeroplane and with a nip of neat rum, kept a nervous eye on the river, which was rapidly rising with each inch of rain. Outside, 2 of the villagers who had insisted on staying behind to guard the aircraft and its sole occupant also kept watch. It was a great comfort, and of her time in New Guinea, she recalled how wonderful the locals were to the expats. Does anybody have an interest in New Guinea? Has anybody been there or got some connection?
I think everyone's shaking their heads.
No. The other bit that I love is landscape. Somebody said to me that I focus a lot on the landscape. And I think maybe because with aviation, it's all about the landscape, because you need the right landscape to put an airplane down. You can't just land anyway. And you're always aware of the landscape and the weather. They're the two things and fuel that dictate mostly. So when I was writing about Esther, the RFDS pilot, the Dutch girl, she was very matter of fact about her story, but to a new set of ears, it was very exciting and very dramatic. But she said to me, "You've made me sound very different to how I feel." She said, "I just live this life and you've made it into a story." And I said, "Well, to somebody else, it's quite dramatic." So I'll just read you one page out of Esther's story. She's signed it for me there, signed the book. So Esther drove to Darwin, and I just had this image of this young 27-year-old blonde Dutch girl alone in her little car, driving on her own through the outback. That's the start of a movie, as far as I can see. Darwin was literally the end and the beginning of the road. Just north of Alice Springs at the Tanami track turnoff, Esther had to make a decision: go left to Kununurra or continue on. She asked a passing truck driver for advice. He looked at the young Dutch woman driving alone in her little Datsun study and drawled, "Darling, the wet season's going to be a bad one. Go straight to Darwin." Esther took him at his word and pushed on up the Stewart Highway before the road was cut by floodwaters. As a fresh pilot with only 250 flying hours, Esther had set out from Sydney to find work. Over the Blue Mountains, she drove as far as Dubbo. She couldn't plan any further than that, but when she got to Dubbo, the age-old technique of knocking on hangar doors didn't yield any results. So she kept driving west towards the Flinders Ranges, north to Alice and beyond, making inquiries all the way. The top end in 1996 was experiencing a severe wet season that pushed Esther to keep driving. She had her eyes set on flying for the RFDS. It was a big dream, but it had to start somewhere, and right now it was starting in the Territory capital, at the friendly and relaxed youth hostel on Mitchell Street. With $7 to her name, money was tight, desperate in fact. Outside, her little car was packed with her worldly goods: clothes, books, cameras, but most importantly, her nav bag and logbook, none of which would pay the rent. She'd get her jewellery back when she came up with some cash, but for now it was security against her rent. First, she undid the gold necklace and put it on the counter. Then she handed over her watch, gold without a chain and clasp. It kept perfect Swiss time. It had been her mother's. She'd only passed away in Holland 6 months earlier, and Esther missed her terribly. I just thought that was the start of a movie. So that's
fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing those with us. I've already just sent through that email to our collections manager to get a few more copies, so hopefully we can get those into everyone's hands very soon. I think we might wrap up for the day. So on behalf of everyone who's come today, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and those stories with us. I'm feeling very inspired. I'm sure everyone else is too. And thank you also for everyone who came, even though it's so sunny outside. So I hope you get a chance to enjoy that sunshine this afternoon. And there's a few thank yous coming through in the chat. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone.